1917. Flanders. The land transformed into liquid mud, devouring all living things. Here, amidst the low-lying fields of Belgium, unfolded one of the bloodiest dramas of the First World War. An operation that historians would later call an ecological catastrophe in military attire. Endless rains, lasting for weeks, turned the already marshy terrain into a true hell on earth. Trenches, dug by soldiers for defense, became their graves. Water rose centimeter by centimeter each hour, relentlessly filling every hollow, every ditch. Men drowned, standing at their posts. Soldiers, falling asleep from exhaustion, woke up neck-deep in icy water. Heavy artillery destroyed the region's natural drainage systems, turning fields into lakes and hills into islands amidst an endless sea of mud. Each artillery volley not only took lives, but also altered the landscape, creating new bodies of water where solid ground once stood.
Europe had never before seen such a vivid example of how nature becomes the most merciless adversary for both sides of a conflict. Flanders is a small region in northern Belgium, bordering France and the Netherlands. This low-lying plain, crisscrossed by numerous rivers and canals, was historically one of Europe's most densely populated and economically developed regions. However, these very geographical features turned it into an ideal arena for one of the most destructive operations of the First World War. Why did military command choose this territory for a large-scale offensive, despite the obvious natural obstacles? The answer lies in the region's strategic position. Flanders was in close proximity to the North Sea coast, where crucial ports, Zeebrugge and Ostend, were located. These ports served as bases for German submarines, which inflicted devastating blows on the British fleet and trade routes. Control over Flanders meant control over the Belgian coast and the ability to neutralize the submarine threat. The natural landscape of Flanders was formed over millennia. Clay soils, lying on an impermeable layer, created ideal conditions for the formation of bogs. Local inhabitants had for centuries built a complex system of drainage canals, allowing them to reclaim land for agriculture. This artificially maintained ecosystem was extremely fragile. It was enough to disrupt the drainage system, and water immediately reclaimed its rights to these territories. The elevation above sea level in many parts of Flanders did not exceed a few meters, and some areas were even below sea level, making them particularly vulnerable to flooding. The terrain consisted of an alternation of small elevations with vast lowland areas. It was these elevations, barely noticeable to the eye in peacetime, that acquired critical significance during military operations. Possession of even an insignificant hill provided a tactical advantage, allowing control over vast territories. The Belgians understood the strategic importance of their land well. Even at the beginning of the war, they deliberately opened sluice gates and flooded part of the coastal lowlands, creating a water barrier to the German advance. This act of deliberate ecological warfare foreshadowed what would later happen in Flanders on a much larger scale. The soil composition of the region was another factor that played a fateful role. The top layer of fertile soil concealed heavy clay beneath it, which, when saturated with water, turned into a viscous mass, sucking in everything that was incautious enough to be on it. In dry weather, this clay hardened, becoming suitable for movement. But in conditions of prolonged rains, it turned into an impassable quagmire. The hydrological features of the region also played their part. Groundwater was close to the surface, which in normal conditions was compensated by the drainage system. However, military operations inevitably destroyed this system, leading to a rapid rise in groundwater levels. The rivers Isère, Lys, and Scheldt, flowing through Flanders, normally calm and manageable, could overflow during autumn rains, flooding the adjacent lowlands. Summer of 1917. In the headquarters of the warring armies, officers bent over maps, developing plans for an operation that was supposed to turn the tide of the war. The British command, led by Field Marshal Douglas Haig, placed enormous hopes on the offensive in Flanders. After bloody and inconclusive battles on the Somme, a victory was needed that could boost the morale of the troops and the nation. The main goal of the British was to break through the German defenses, capture the Belgian coast, and eliminate submarine bases in Zeebrugge and Ostend. Haig was confident. A decisive blow would lead to the collapse of the German front. The German command, anticipating the offensive, prepared for defense. General Erich Ludendorff ordered the creation of a deeply echeloned system of fortifications, consisting of 3 defensive lines. Each included concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and a dense network of barbed wire. The Germans expected to wear down the enemy in defensive battles and then launch a counterattack. Neither side paid due attention to meteorological forecasts, which indicated the likelihood of prolonged rains in the region. The meteorological services of both armies warned of the possibility of an unusually wet season, but military planners dismissed these warnings as insignificant factors, a fatal mistake that would result in tens of thousands of lives. British engineers, who had studied the terrain, reported on the complex drainage system of the region and warned that its destruction would lead to flooding. These reports were noted, but did not affect the overall plan of the operation. The military leadership believed that modern technology, tanks, artillery, engineering units, could overcome any obstacles. A fatal delusion based on faith in technological superiority over nature. Artillery played a special role in the planning. The British prepared an unprecedented artillery barrage. 4.5 million shells were to fall on German positions several days before the start of the offensive. No one thought that such a concentration of explosions would turn the Earth's surface into a lunar landscape of craters, which would immediately fill with water from rain and groundwater. Local residents, who had lived on this land for generations and knew its capricious nature, could have warned of the consequences, but no one asked them. Belgian farmers observing the preparations shook their heads. They knew what would happen to their fields after the first heavy rain. Their experience, passed down from generation to generation, said, "One cannot disturb the fragile balance of this land." The soldiers preparing for the offensive had no idea what kind of enemy they would have to face. They were taught to fight people, but not nature. In letters home, they expressed optimism, believing in a quick victory. A typical phrase from soldiers' letters of that time. The bitter irony is that many of the authors of these lines would soon be fighting not to advance, but not to drown in the mud of Flanders. Meanwhile, heavy equipment and convoys had already begun to destroy the roads of the region. Tank tracks and artillery wheels cut through the topsoil, exposing the clay base. The first rains, which began a week before the offensive, turned the access roads into rivers of mud. But the command continued to believe that the weather would improve. A small temporary inconvenience. This is how one of the staff officers described the situation. The tragedy of the Flanders operation began not on the battlefield, but in the staff offices, where maps and plans obscured reality. The sky above Flanders seemed to have opened up in July 1917. What meteorologists predicted as a chance of precipitation turned into a biblical flood that continued for weeks. In 3 months, from July to October, 3 times more precipitation fell than usually occurs in an entire year in this region. The rains fell with such intensity that soldiers in the trenches said, "It's not drops falling from the sky, but solid threads of water." Water fell from the sky in a solid wall, washing away everything in its path. British meteorologists recorded 31 days of continuous precipitation, an unprecedented phenomenon even for the humid climate of Northern Europe. Barometers showed record low pressure, and synoptic maps were dotted with alarming cyclones, one after another creeping onto the long-suffering land of Flanders. Nature seemed to have decided to intervene in the human war, reminding them of its might. Each new downpour turned the battlefield into an increasingly impassable swamp. Water, finding no natural drainage due to destroyed drainage systems, accumulated in lowlands, forming lakes where once there were fields and meadows. The clay soil, saturated with moisture, turned into a viscous mass that sucked in people and equipment. Artillery craters, which dotted the entire area, filled with water in a matter of minutes, creating deadly traps for advancing soldiers. Many drowned, not from bullets, but simply by falling into an unseen pit hidden under a layer of muddy water. Veterans recalled, "We didn't fight so much as we struggled with the mud." The air temperature, uncharacteristically low for the summer months, exacerbated the soldiers' suffering. Soaked to the bone, they froze in the icy water that filled the trenches. Hypothermia became as dangerous an enemy as German machine guns. Medical journals of the time recorded thousands of cases of trench foot, a condition in which prolonged exposure of the feet to cold water led to tissue necrosis. Amputations became commonplace in field hospitals. Local residents, who had lived on this land for generations, had never seen such a cataclysm. The old-timers of Flanders said that the very earth is weeping at what people are doing on it. Belgian farmers, forced to leave their homes due to hostilities, watched with bitterness as their carefully cultivated fields turned into an endless swamp. The system of drainage canals, created over centuries to drain excess moisture, was completely destroyed by artillery shelling. Small rivers and streams, usually calm and inconspicuous, overflowed their banks, spreading across the lowlands. The water rose with frightening speed, 10 to 15 centimeters overnight in some places. Soldiers woke up to find their sleeping places flooded. Trenches, dug to protect against enemy fire, turned into watery graves. British engineering units worked around the clock, trying to pump out water and reinforce the trench walls. But their efforts were like trying to bail out the sea with a spoon. Nature took its toll. Trenches, originally conceived as a reliable refuge from enemy fire, transformed into true watery graves in Flanders. The complex system of trenches, dugouts, and communication passages, which was supposed to protect soldiers, became their prison and a place of agonizing death. With each day of incessant rains, the situation became increasingly catastrophic. The water rose relentlessly, turning even the deepest and best-equipped trenches into ditches filled with liquid mud. Soldiers recalled having to stand knee-deep, sometimes even waist-deep, in icy slush. There was nowhere to sleep. Any horizontal surface ended up submerged. People dozed standing, leaning against the trench wall, risking slipping into the water and drowning in their sleep. British Corporal John Ferguson wrote in his diary, "We are no longer soldiers, but some kind of amphibian creatures. Day and night we stand in water. Our skin turns white and wrinkles, like that of drowned people. Many no longer feel their legs. They are simply dying in this cold hell." Engineering units fought the water element round the clock. They installed pumps, tried to build dams from sandbags, and laid wooden planks. But all these efforts proved futile. The water arrived faster than it could be pumped out. Every artillery shelling destroyed the hard-won drainage systems, and everything started anew. German positions, located on small hills, were in a somewhat better situation. But even there, the situation was critical. One German officer described his dugout as a submarine that forgot to surface. Water seeped in from everywhere, from above, from the sides, from below. It was impossible to stay dry even for a minute. Soldiers on both sides showed incredible ingenuity, trying to adapt to these inhumane conditions. They created improvised platforms from anything they could get their hands on: shell boxes, planks, even the bodies of fallen comrades. Rubber cloaks and boots were especially valued, but they were catastrophically scarce. Many tied themselves with belts to the trench walls so as not to slip into the water during sleep. The British developed special wooden grates for the bottom of the trenches, duckboards, but these quickly sank in the liquid mud or floated up when the water rose. Wounded comrades became a particular horror for the soldiers. In normal conditions, they could have been evacuated, but in Flanders, severely wounded men who fell into the water often drowned before help could reach them. Medics trying to carry out the wounded themselves became easy targets for snipers or artillery. There were frequent cases where soldiers, even with a minor leg wound, could not get out of the liquid mud and slowly submerged in it until they drowned. Artillery. That was the true architect of the Flemish landscape in 1917. Every day, thousands of shells slammed into the softened earth, transforming the natural terrain into a chaotic jumble of craters and torn-up soil. The scale of artillery impact on the area was unprecedented in the history of warfare. British artillery, in preparation for the Third Battle of Ypres, fired 4.5 million shells at German positions. This bombardment lasted 10 days, turning 30 square kilometers of land into a lunar landscape. Each heavy shell, exploding, created a crater up to 10 meters in diameter and up to 4 meters deep. In the conditions of incessant rains, these craters instantly filled with water, forming thousands of small lakes. The shell-pocked earth lost its ability to absorb moisture. The topsoil was literally ground into a pulp, and the underlying clay layers, exposed by the explosions, turned into a waterproof barrier. Water, finding no natural drainage, accumulated on the surface, creating vast, flooded areas. British Sergeant Edward Williams recalled, "Every new artillery barrage changed the map of the area. Where yesterday there was a relatively dry section, today a lake appeared. Landmarks disappeared, new ones emerged. It was as if we were fighting on a constantly changing planet." Artillery had a particularly destructive effect on Flanders' drainage system. For centuries, local residents had created a complex network of canals and dams regulating groundwater levels. This system, finely tuned and requiring constant maintenance, was completely destroyed in the first weeks of fighting. Shells tore apart dams, filled canals, and disrupted the natural flow of water. The result was a complete change in the region's hydrological regime. Rivers and streams, deprived of their natural channels, overflowed, forming vast, shallow swamps. Underground aquifers, damaged by explosions, rose to the surface, creating new springs and sources where they had never been before. German Lieutenant Ernst Junger wrote in his diary, "The earth seems to weep with thousands of new eyes. Water seeps from everywhere, turning trenches into canals and fields into lakes. We no longer know where the water ends and the land begins." Artillery bombardments not only created new bodies of water, but also changed the terrain, creating artificial dams and impoundments. Earth thrown up by explosions formed ramparts and embankments that blocked the natural flow of water. Destroyed farm buildings, wreckage of equipment, bodies of the dead. All this became additional obstacles to water movement, exacerbating the flooding problem. The situation was particularly dramatic in the lowlands, where water accumulated from all over the area. These natural depressions turned into real lakes up to 2 meters deep. Soldiers called them lakes of death, as their murky waters concealed unexploded shells, barbed wire, and the bodies of the dead. The human cost of the Flanders operation surpassed the most grim predictions of the command. The casualty statistics, collected after the war, are staggering in their scale. Over 400,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing on both sides during 4 months of fighting. But dry figures cannot convey the true horror of what happened, when nature becomes as merciless an enemy as the adversary. British forces suffered the heaviest losses, about 245,000 men. Germany lost approximately 200,000 soldiers. French losses amounted to about 85,000 men. The Belgian army, fighting on its home soil, lost over 30,000 soldiers. However, the uniqueness of the Flanders meat grinder lay in the nature of these losses. According to military historians, up to 30% of all casualties were the result not of enemy fire, but of an environmental catastrophe. Thousands of soldiers drowned in flooded trenches and shell craters. Even more died from hypothermia, having spent days and nights waist-deep in icy water. Trench foot, a condition where leg tissues die due to prolonged exposure to cold moisture, incapacitated tens of thousands of fighters. Many of them later became disabled after amputations. The British military doctor Charles McCarrow wrote in his memoirs, "I never thought I would be amputating limbs not because of wounds, but because people simply stood in water." Pneumonia and other respiratory diseases mowed down soldiers more effectively than machine guns. In conditions of constant dampness and cold, the immune system could not withstand. Medical records of that time show that for every soldier wounded in battle, there were 2 or 3 soldiers incapacitated by illness. The wounded had an especially hard time. Falling into a water-filled crater, they often drowned before medics could reach them. Those who managed to be evacuated faced a high risk of infection. The mud of Flanders, saturated with decomposing remains and bacteria, turned even minor wounds into deadly ones. The survival rate after injuries was catastrophically low. Environmental factors also changed combat tactics. Attacks were often thwarted not by enemy resistance, but by the impossibility of overcoming the flooded no-man's land. Soldiers attempting to cross it literally sank in the mud under the weight of their equipment. Surviving participants of those events recalled seeing their comrades slowly submerging into the mire, unable to get out, and doomed to a torturous death. German Corporal Walter Klempt described in a letter home, "We are not so much shooting at the enemy as watching him drown. This is not war, but some twisted spectacle." British Corporal Thomas Edwards recalled, "The most terrible thing was not that people died, but how they died, slowly sinking into the mud, knowing that there would be no help. That's worse than any bullet. Even burying the dead became impossible. Dug graves immediately filled with water. Bodies were left where death struck, often simply submerged in mud or water. Many remained undiscovered, swallowed by the merciless land of Flanders. After the war, search teams found the remains of soldiers in the most unexpected places, in drainage channels, in the basements of ruined farms, in overgrown ponds. Only a small fraction could be identified. The medical consequences of the Flanders operation were as horrifying as the combat itself. Flooded trenches became incubators of disease, where human bodies were subjected to trials for which they were not designed. Trench foot, a specific condition in which soldiers' feet, constantly in cold water, began to die, became a real epidemic. The skin paled, became covered with ulcers, and lost sensitivity. In severe cases, tissues blackened and began to decompose directly on the living person. Field surgeons performed up to 20 amputations a day, saving soldiers from blood poisoning. British military doctor James Patterson recorded in his diary, "I cut off more legs due to water and mud than due to German bullets. Nature proved to be a more merciless adversary than man." Hypothermia claimed the lives of hundreds of soldiers weekly. At a water temperature of about 5 degrees Celsius, the human body lost heat 25 times faster than in the air. Soldiers who spent 12 to 14 hours in flooded trenches fell into a stupor, transitioning into sleep and then into death. Medical reports of the time described cases where soldiers fell asleep standing, leaning against the trench wall, and never woke up. Respiratory diseases spread at an alarming rate: pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis. In conditions of constant dampness and hypothermia, the soldiers' immune systems could not cope. Field hospitals were overflowing with coughing, suffocating people with feverish glints in their eyes. Antibiotics did not exist then, and doctors could only offer rest, warmth, and hot tea, a luxury unavailable at the front lines. Waterborne infectious diseases became another deadly enemy. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera. The pathogens of these diseases thrived in the polluted waters of Flanders. The water in the trenches mixed with human waste, the blood of the wounded, and the decomposing bodies of the dead. Every gulp of such water could be fatal. Soldiers knew of this danger, but thirst often proved stronger than fear. German medic Wilhelm Brandt recalled, "We saw people drinking from puddles in which dead rats floated." A day or two later, these same soldiers writhed in pain, their bodies dehydrated from incessant diarrhea. Many did not survive. Wounds, even the most minor, in conditions of constant dampness and contact with contaminated water, often led to infection. Gas gangrene, an infection caused by anaerobic bacteria thriving without oxygen access, became a real scourge of field hospitals. Bacteria entered wounds along with soil particles and rapidly multiplied in damaged tissues, releasing toxins and gases. The flesh around the wound darkened, swelled, and emitted a characteristic sweetish smell of decomposition. Without immediate amputation, chances of survival were practically nil. But alongside physical suffering, soldiers also faced psychological traumas that at the time could not yet be diagnosed and treated. What is now called post-traumatic stress disorder was then called shell shock or war neurosis. The constant fear of death, the sight of mutilated comrades' bodies, the incessant roar of artillery, all this destroyed the psyche of even the most resilient soldiers. A peculiarity of the Flanders operation was that environmental conditions exacerbated psychological traumas. The constant struggle with the water element, the feeling of helplessness before the forces of nature, the inability to find a dry place to rest, all this created a feeling of absolute hopelessness. British psychiatrist Louis Yayland, who worked with Flanders veterans, noted a special form of phobia, which he called Passchendaele hydrophobia, after one of the battles of the operation. A pathological fear of water and rain that haunted many soldiers for years after the war. Survivors reported that even light rain caused them panic attacks and memories of the nightmares of Flanders. The medical services of both warring sides were unprepared for such a combination of combat and environmental factors. Evacuating the wounded through flooded terrain became an almost impossible task. Stretcher bearers drowned in the mud under the weight of stretchers with the wounded. Ambulances got stuck on washed-out roads. The wounded who could not be evacuated often died of hypothermia or infections before medics could reach them. The Flanders operation became a turning point in the development of military medicine. After it, the armies of all countries began to pay more attention to the prevention of diseases associated with the environmental conditions of warfare. New methods were developed to combat trench foot, including special ointments, regular changing of socks and shoes, and periodic foot massage to improve blood circulation. The first studies of psychological traumas sustained in war appeared, which later led to the formation of an entire field in psychiatry. For the British public consciousness, the Flanders operation became a symbol of the environmental catastrophe of war, a lesson that forever changed the understanding of the relationship between military actions and nature. No nation paid as high a price for this lesson as Great Britain, which lost the flower of its youth in the Flemish swamps. For the British, the operation in Flanders was not just a military defeat, but a profound cultural shock. The poets of the Lost Generation, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, Robert Graves, captured in their works not so much the horrors of battles as the nightmare of fighting nature itself. Owen's poem became one of the most poignant testimonies of the environmental catastrophe. In British historiography, the Flanders operation was called the interwar historians such as Basil Liddell Hart and John Fuller sharply criticized the command's decision to launch an offensive in clearly unfavorable environmental conditions. Their works laid the foundation for a new approach to military planning, in which natural factors began to be considered as a crucial element of strategy. Flanders changed British military doctrine for decades to come. Military academies introduced mandatory courses in military geography and ecology. Officers were taught to evaluate not only enemy positions, but also the influence of natural conditions on combat operations. The British General Staff created a special unit of military meteorologists and hydrologists whose task was to predict the impact of weather conditions on planned operations. It is noteworthy that the lessons of Flanders were applied during the Second World War. The planning of the Normandy landings in June 1944 included a thorough analysis of weather conditions, soil conditions, and tides. General Eisenhower, who commanded the operation, repeatedly referred to the experience of Flanders, emphasizing the need to consider environmental factors when planning large-scale military operations. In the British public consciousness, Flanders became a symbol of senseless sacrifice. Annual commemoration ceremonies at the Cenotaph in London and memorials across the country always include a mention of those who drowned in the mud of Flanders. Red poppies, which became a symbol of remembrance for those who died in the First World War, are associated by Britons primarily with the fields of Flanders, where these flowers grew in abundance on blood-soaked soil after the fighting ended. British ecologists studied the consequences of the Flanders operation throughout the 20th century. Studies have shown that some areas of land in Flanders have still not fully recovered. The concentration of heavy metals from shells, chemicals from poisonous gases, and products of organic decomposition created a unique ecosystem where some plant and animal species disappeared while others mutated, adapting to new conditions. British researchers paid particular attention to the psychological consequences of the environmental catastrophe for surviving soldiers. Medical archives contain thousands of case histories of veterans suffering from specific phobias related to water, mud, and confined spaces. Many could not take baths, experienced panic attacks during rain, or could not stand the sight of any standing water. These studies laid the foundation for the modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder. For the German command, Flanders became the embodiment of ancient Germanic legends about cursed lands devouring entire armies. If the British perceived the swamps as a tragic accident, the Germans saw in them an almost mystical adversary with whom it was impossible to negotiate. Der Schlamm ist unser wahrer Feind. The mud is our true enemy. This phrase became the leitmotif of German military reports from the Western Front in the autumn of 1917. German Lieutenant Ernst Jünger, who later became a famous writer, recorded in his diary, "We are fighting not the English, but nature itself. Every day I see how the earth devours my soldiers. It doesn't kill them, but literally swallows them whole, like an ancient monster. The German High Command, led by General Ludendorff, initially considered the ecological factor an advantage for the defending side. Directives emphasized that the flooded no man's land would become a natural obstacle to the British offensive. However, it soon became clear that the elements did not choose sides. Although German positions were indeed located on relative high ground, the problem of flooded trenches was almost as acute as for the enemy. German engineering units developed a whole system of devices for combating water. Wasserstiefel, special thigh-high waterproof boots made of rubberized fabric, gained particular fame. However, there was a catastrophic shortage of them. A platoon of 30 men had at best 5 or 6 pairs. Soldiers passed them to each other during guard changes as a most precious commodity. Another German invention was the Schwimmdeck, floating wooden platforms installed in the trenches. Unlike British duckboards, they were not attached to the bottom but to the trench walls and rose with the water level. This allowed soldiers to remain relatively dry even during significant flooding. German meticulousness was also evident in the organization of drainage work. Each platoon was obliged to maintain a specific section of the drainage system in working order. Commanders faced severe punishment for failing to do so. Every day, thousands of soldiers scooped water out of the trenches with buckets, repaired pumps, and laid new drainage channels. But all these efforts were like trying to stop the tide. Nature invariably prevailed. German military doctors were the first to systematize observations of new types of diseases associated with the ecological conditions of Flanders. In his report to the command in October 1917, Dr. Wilhelm Schulze identified a special syndrome which he called Flandern fever. Flanders fever. This condition was characterized by a combination of physical exhaustion, hypothermia, and mental stupor. Soldiers suffering from this syndrome became apathetic, lost the ability to make decisions, and often simply froze in place, becoming easy targets for snipers. France, like other participants in the First World War, drew its bitter lessons from the Flanders Offensive. For the French command, this battle became a symbol of duality, the heroism of soldiers and the helplessness of man in the face of raging nature. General Philippe Pétain, one of the key French military leaders of that period, wrote in his memoirs, "In Flanders we fought not only against the Germans, but also against the very land, which, it seemed, rose up against all warring parties." French troops, although participating in the operation on a smaller scale than the British, faced the same environmental problems. French colonial units from North Africa, unaccustomed to the cold and dampness of Northern Europe, had an especially difficult time. Soldiers from Algeria and Morocco suffered massively from hypothermia and respiratory diseases. One French officer wrote in his diary, "Our Tunisians are dying not from bullets, but from the rain. They have never seen so much water and do not know how to fight it." French engineering troops developed their own methods of combating flooding. The system of Poincaré pumps, compact hand pumps named after the French president, gained particular fame. These devices, lighter and more mobile than their British counterparts, allowed for quick pumping of water from small sections of trenches. However, their effectiveness in conditions of incessant rains remained minimal. The medical service of the French Army was one of the first to begin a systematic study of the influence of environmental conditions on the health of soldiers. Dr. Marcel Lermite organized a special research group that collected data on diseases associated with prolonged stay in flooded trenches. The results of these studies formed the basis of a new direction in military medicine: environmental pathology. After the war, France drew important lessons from the Flanders catastrophe for its military doctrine. The Maginot Line, built in the 1930s to protect against possible German aggression, included a complex system of drainage and wastewater disposal. The engineers who designed these fortifications constantly referred to the experience of Flanders, emphasizing the need to protect against water as much as against enemy fire. French society perceived the ecological catastrophe of Flanders as a warning about the fragility of the balance between man and nature. In the interwar period, a powerful ecological movement emerged in France, one of whose slogans was the phrase, "Remember Flanders, nature does not forgive neglect." French writers and poets, such as Henri Barbusse and Louis Aragon, paid special attention to the ecological aspects of battles in their works about the war. Barbusse's novel, Under Fire, contains poignant descriptions of soldiers' struggle not only with the enemy, but also with mud, water, and cold. For French historiography, the Flanders Offensive became a classic example of how underestimating natural factors can negate any tactical advantages. Military academies in France still study this operation as an example of an ecological catastrophe caused by human activity. Of particular interest is the influence of the Flanders Offensive on the development of French hydrological science. Many military engineers, after demobilization, dedicated themselves to the study of water resources and the creation of flood protection systems. Their experience in combating the water element in Flanders proved invaluable for civil engineering and land reclamation. It is noteworthy that French farmers, returning to the war-ravaged lands of Flanders, brought with them new methods of drainage and soil restoration. Traditional technologies proved ineffective in conditions of a completely disturbed water balance. Decades of painstaking work were required to restore fertility to these lands. Poland, though not directly involved in the battles on the Flemish marshes, carefully studied this tragic experience. For the young Polish state, resurrected after the First World War, the lessons of the ecological catastrophe in Flanders became invaluable material for shaping its own military doctrine. Polish military theorists of the interwar period, such as Władysław Sikorski and Tadeusz Kuczeba, meticulously analyzed the mistakes made by the command of the warring parties when planning operations in an ecologically challenging region. The Warsaw Military Academy introduced a special course on military ecology, where the Flanders operation was studied as a classic example of underestimating natural factors. Polish General Kazimierz Sączkowski, who visited the battlefields in Flanders in 1922, wrote in his report, "We must learn from the mistakes of others." Poland, with its extensive swampy territories in the east and north, may face similar problems in the event of war. Our army must be prepared not only to confront the enemy, but also to fight against nature itself. Polish military personnel paid particular attention to the engineering aspects of warfare in marshy terrain. In 1925, under the leadership of Colonel Józef Beck, large-scale exercises were conducted in Polesia, a region known for its extensive swamps. Soldiers practiced skills in rapidly constructing drainage systems, building temporary dams, and creating floating platforms for artillery. These exercises directly drew upon the experience of Flanders, but with adjustments for local geographical features. Polish medics also drew important lessons from the Flemish catastrophe. Dr. Stanislaw Konopacki, who headed Poland's military medical service in the 20s, developed a special program for the prevention of diseases associated with prolonged exposure to cold water. Particular attention was paid to preventing trench foot. Soldiers were taught to regularly rub their feet, change socks, and use special ointments that protect the skin from prolonged exposure to moisture. Departments of ecological pathology were established in Polish military hospitals, where doctors specialized in treating diseases caused by extreme natural conditions. In 1931, an international conference on military ecology was held in Warsaw, where Polish specialists presented their research based on an analysis of the Flanders operation. General Marian Kukiel's report, Ecological Factors in Military Planning, aroused great interest among foreign colleagues. It thoroughly analyzed the errors of the British and German commands, which did not take into account the climatic and hydrological features of the region when planning the operation. The Polish experience of studying the Flemish catastrophe found practical application during the Soviet-Polish War of 1920, when hostilities were conducted, among other places, in the marshy territories of Polesia. Polish troops, using knowledge of the influence of natural conditions on the course of hostilities, were able to avoid many problems encountered by armies in Flanders. Engineering units created drainage systems in advance, and the medical service was prepared for specific diseases characteristic of marshy terrain. For Polish military planning, the Flanders operation became a warning against overconfidence in technological superiority over nature. General Wacław Stachiewicz, chief of the General Staff of Poland in the 30s, repeatedly emphasized in his speeches, nature can be both an ally and an adversary. But unlike a human adversary, with nature one cannot conclude an armistice. Its laws are inexorable and demand respect. Polish military doctrine, formed in the interwar period under the influence of the lessons of Flanders, paid particular attention to the geographical factor. Every officer of the Polish army was obliged to study not only tactics and strategy, but also the basics of hydrology, meteorology, and soil science. This knowledge was considered a necessary element of military education. While the leading European powers battled on the fields of Flanders, which had transformed into a nightmarish swamp, neutral Spain carefully observed this tragedy. Unfettered by participation in the conflict, Spanish scientists gained a unique opportunity to study the social consequences of the ecological catastrophe caused by the war. These studies laid the foundation for a new scientific discipline, the sociology of war disasters. In 1918, when the mud of Flanders still held the bodies of thousands of dead, Professor Antonio Garcia Martinez of the University of Madrid organized the first scientific expedition to the affected areas. His team, consisting of sociologists, psychologists, and anthropologists, set an ambitious task: to study how the ecological catastrophe had changed the social structure of the region. We discovered a society transformed not only by bombs and bullets, but by the very earth itself, Martinez wrote in his report. People returning to flooded villages no longer trusted the ground beneath their feet. Peasants, who for centuries had lived in harmony with this land, now looked upon it as a traitor. Spanish researchers paid particular attention to a phenomenon they called ecological trauma, a deep psychological shock caused not so much by military actions as by the destruction of the familiar natural environment. Dr. Juan Sanchez, a psychiatrist from Barcelona, documented cases of specific phobias among the inhabitants of Flanders. A pathological fear of rain, a dread of any bodies of water, panic at the sight of wet ground. In one of the most telling cases, a farmer from the vicinity of Ypres refused to leave his house during rain and built his new home on stilts, although the area was dry. "I saw the earth swallow people whole," he explained. "It can do it again." Spanish sociologists were the first to describe the phenomenon later termed ecological displacement. Unlike ordinary war refugees who leave a combat zone, ecological refugees did not return to their homelands even after the war ended. The reason was not the destruction of homes, but a deep distrust of the land itself, which had transformed from a provider into a threat. Professor Miguel Ortega of the University of Seville conducted a large-scale study of changes in the social structure of Flemish villages. He found that the traditional hierarchy, based on land ownership, collapsed after the war. The land, transformed into a swamp, lost its value, Ortega noted. Wealthy landowners became impoverished, while those with practical skills, carpenters, masons, engineers, became the new elite, capable of rebuilding what was destroyed. Spanish studies showed how the ecological catastrophe transformed gender roles in affected communities. With the death of men and the degradation of agricultural lands, women were forced to learn new professions and assume the roles of heads of families. Dr. Isabella Rodriguez, one of the first female sociologists in Spain, noted, "The war and the mud of Flanders achieved what decades of struggle for women's rights could not. They destroyed the traditional patriarchal order." Of particular value were the Spanish studies of children who had experienced the ecological catastrophe of Flanders. Psychologist Rafael Blanco documented specific games played by children in the affected areas: drowning games, mud rescue games. These games served as a means of psychological adaptation to the traumatic experience they had endured. The results of the Spanish research were published in 1923 in the monograph The Social Effects of Ecological War, which became a classic of sociological literature. This work laid the foundation for a new scientific discipline, the eco-sociology of conflicts. The consequences of the Flanders operation for the region's ecology proved truly devastating and long-lasting. When the last shots faded in November 1917, the survivors beheld a completely transformed land. No longer a battlefield, but an alien landscape of mud, craters, and stagnant water. The nature of Flanders, shaped over centuries as a finely balanced ecosystem, was turned into an ecological desert in a matter of months. The first studies into the scale of the catastrophe were conducted by Belgian scientists as early as 1919. Professor Jean-Baptiste Dumont of the University of Leuven, who led the expedition to the former combat zone, wrote in his report, "What we saw is beyond description. This is no longer earth but some new substance, a mixture of clay, metal, chemicals, and remains. The soil is dead. Not even the most unpretentious plants grow in it. The hydrological regime of the region was completely disrupted. Numerous shell craters filled with water created a new network of artificial reservoirs. Natural drainage systems formed over millennia were destroyed. Underground aquifers, exposed by explosions, surfaced in the most unexpected places, creating new springs and swamps. British hydrologist Arthur Hopkins, who studied Flanders in the 20s, noted, "We are observing the birth of a new hydrological system. Nature is starting from scratch, as after an ice age. Chemical contamination of soils reached unprecedented levels. Millions of artillery shells, detonated in a relatively small area, saturated the land with heavy metals, lead, mercury, arsenic. Poisonous gases used by both sides settled on the soil, creating toxic compounds lethal to all living things. In some places, the concentration of chemicals was so high that even 10 years after the war ended, no grass grew there. The restoration of the Flanders ecosystem became one of the most extensive environmental operations of the first half of the 20th century. The Belgian government established a special commission for the reclamation of lands affected by military actions. It was headed by the renowned agronomist Emile van der Velde, who developed a comprehensive 50-year restoration plan. The first stage was the clearing of the territory from unexploded ordnance and military debris. This extremely dangerous work continued for over 10 years. Thousands of sappers, many of whom were veterans of the Flanders operation themselves, methodically combed every meter of land. Hundreds of them died, detonating shells and mines buried in the mud. Even today, over 100 years after the war ended, Flanders farmers annually find hundreds of unexploded ordnance in their fields. a sad legacy of that ecological catastrophe. The next step was the restoration of the drainage system. Hydrological engineers developed a new canal scheme, taking into account the altered terrain. Where there were once fields, there were now artificial lakes that could not be drained. Instead of fighting them, the Belgians integrated them into the new hydrological system, turning them into regulators of the water regime. A particular problem was soil detoxification. Traditional methods, such as liming and the application of organic fertilizers, proved ineffective against such massive contamination. Belgian scientists developed a new method of phytoremediation, using plants to clean the soil. Certain species, capable of accumulating heavy metals without harm to themselves, were planted in contaminated areas, then harvested and disposed of. This process, slow and laborious, gradually reduced the concentration of toxic substances to an acceptable level. Restoring the region's biodiversity was another complex task. Many plant and animal species, typical of Flanders before the war, completely disappeared from these areas. To bring them back, special reserves were created where conditions as close as possible to pre-war ones were recreated. Plant seeds, preserved in botanical gardens, were planted in prepared soil. Animals from neighboring regions were gradually reintroduced into the restored ecosystems. It is noteworthy that some areas of the former battlefield were decided to be left untouched. As memorials and a reminder of the catastrophe, these territories, known as Red Belt Zones, remain uninhabited to this day. The soil there is so saturated with metal and chemicals that restoration is considered impossible. Over time, unique ecosystems have formed in these zones, inhabited by species adapted to extreme conditions. Today, more than a century after the ecological catastrophe, Flanders has once again become a prosperous agricultural region. Fields, once turned into swamps of death, again yield rich harvests. But beneath this prosperous facade, the scars of the past still linger. Regular studies show elevated levels of heavy metals in the soil and groundwater. Some plant and animal species have never returned to these places. The ecological restoration of Flanders became an important lesson for the whole world. It showed that nature has an amazing ability to self-recover, but there are limits beyond which the damage becomes irreparable. This experience formed the basis of modern approaches to the ecological rehabilitation of territories affected by military actions. From Vietnam to Iraq, wherever war left its scars on the land, methods first tried on the fields of Flanders were applied. Today, Flanders is a place of pilgrimage for thousands of people from all over the world. On the fields where soldiers of warring armies once drowned in mud, there are now memorials and museums preserving the memory of that environmental catastrophe. Red poppies, which have become a symbol of remembrance for those who died in the First World War, bloom every spring on this land, recalling the price humanity paid for its carelessness before the forces of nature. The memorial complex at the Menin Gate in Ypres gathers hundreds of visitors every evening for the Last Post ceremony. For over 100 years, every day at 8 in the evening, a bugle call sounds here in memory of the fallen. Among the names carved on the walls of the memorial are thousands of those who fell victim not only to bullets and shells, but also to the very land of Flanders. In the Passchendaele Museum, visitors can see a reconstruction of flooded trenches, a vivid testament to the conditions in which soldiers had to survive. The exhibition, dedicated to the environmental aspects of the battle, tells how military actions changed the landscape and hydrological regime of the region. Modern ecologists continue to study the long-term consequences of those events. Research shows that even a century later, the soil of Flanders contains abnormally high concentrations of heavy metals and other toxic substances, a legacy of millions of shells that exploded on this land. In some places, it is still impossible to drink water from wells due to groundwater contamination. Every year, sappers defuse hundreds of unexploded ordnance that farmers find in their fields. The iron harvest of Flanders. This is what locals call this sinister phenomenon. For modern military science, the Flanders operation became a classic example of how underestimation of environmental factors can negate any tactical and strategic advantages. Military academies around the world study this case as a warning against excessive self-confidence in confronting nature. Military ecologists have developed an entire system for assessing the potential environmental impact of military operations. Modern operational planning necessarily includes an analysis of the climatic, hydrological, and geological features of the theater of operations. The lessons of Flanders are also reflected in international humanitarian law. The Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques, adopted in 1976, became a direct consequence of understanding the environmental catastrophes of the 20th century wars, including the Flanders operation. For the environmental movement, the events in Flanders became a powerful argument in the fight for environmental protection. They vividly demonstrated how fragile the balance of natural systems can be, and how difficult it is to restore it after destruction. Philosophers and ethicists use the example of Flanders to discuss humanity's moral responsibility to nature. The renowned eco-philosopher Arne Næss often referred to this catastrophe as an example of what he called ecological blindness, the inability to foresee the long-term consequences of interfering with natural processes. Perhaps the main lesson of Flanders is that there are no winners in war when the ecological well-being of the planet is at stake. Nature recognizes no national borders and takes no sides in human conflicts. The damage inflicted upon it ultimately returns to people, regardless of what flag they raise. Today, in an era of global environmental challenges, this lesson is more relevant than ever. Climate change, ocean pollution, biodiversity loss. All these problems demand from humanity the same unity and determination that ultimately put an end to the bloodshed of the First World War. Flanders reminds us, we cannot conquer nature. We can only learn to live in harmony with it or perish by ignoring its laws. The fields of Flanders, where fierce battles once raged, are now again covered with golden wheat and green grass. Nature has healed its wounds, although the scars are still visible to the attentive eye. This place has become a symbol not only of tragedy, but also of hope, a testament that even after the most terrible catastrophe, revival is possible if people are willing to make an effort to heal the land.